Hi everyone, I'm Maria McLachlan, and I'm sorry that I've been absent, but I've been busy with lots of other stuff. It is a sad fact that a number of people of some science education have been captured by some of the nutty ideas of genderism. One of those is one Forrest Valkai. Forrest calls himself an educator, but so far as I can see, that just means he has a YouTube channel. So by that token, perhaps I can claim to be an educator too. In the first minute of his video entitled Sex and Sensibility, he mentions gender twice and doesn't mention sex at all. The first time he mentions gender is when he tells us that the argument that you can't change gender is stupid. He then tells us that he had decided to make a, quotes, solid YouTube video that explains in layman's terms how this whole two-gender system works or doesn't work from a biological perspective. So my interest was piqued in that first minute, because why would a biologist be talking about a gender system at all? People may disagree nowadays over the definition of sex, but biologically it has a clear meaning. It depends on gametes. By the way, if you are on Twitter, you would do better to follow the much published developmental biologist Dr. Emma Hilton, at Fond of Beetles, who, unlike Mr. Forrest Valkai, is not enthralled to gender ideology. But the word gender is used in different ways by different people. So given that Forrest was talking about gender from the outset, I fully expected him to provide his definition of it from the outset, but he doesn't. What he ended up producing can best be described as a gish gallop. If you're unfamiliar with that term, it is named after an American young earth creationist, now dead, called Duane Gish, who apparently used this strategy to, I guess, try to wrong foot his opponents. It involves overwhelming an opponent in a debate with weak arguments, half-truths, and superfluous information. I'm not saying that everything Forrest says in his 30-minute, 7,000-word lecture is untrue, not at all. I am saying bits of it are very misleading, bits of it don't make sense, and the bulk of the information he gives is irrelevant to the very weak argument that is threaded throughout the video in support of genderism. Being crammed with so much detail makes it quite difficult to isolate that argument, which is an ideological one. To the extremely gullible, he makes it sound like it's real science. And this is compounded at the end when he provides what he claims are the sources for his video. There are over 230 of them, and they are not referenced. So if you want to look up the source of a specific assertion or claim that Forrest makes during the course of the video, you have to wade through this long alphabetically ordered list in the hope of finding something there that sounds like it might be the right source for the specific claim, and then to read through it to establish whether it is. This is not how to educate people, it is how to deceive them, although I'm sure that in Forrest's case it is completely unintentional. But what he should have done is show the references on screen as he's making each assertion, or better still, link to them below the video, making clear which claim each source refers to. I owe a debt of gratitude to a couple of biologists I spoke to about this video, women who'd been studying and teaching biology since before Forrest was born. So let's jump in at just after the first minute.
I'm throwing this in here right at the outset because I want to try to avoid the insane argument that we are somehow special or have some privileged place in this world. We're not, and we don't.
I agree. We are members of the animal kingdom, we are mammals, and like all mammals, we have two sexes, male and female, each sex with a specific reproductive role. Prove me wrong. This is politically important because women have been exploited and oppressed by men throughout history and across cultures on the basis of our sex. And you can try proving me wrong on that too, if you have a mind to.
Second of all, throughout the course of this video, I'm going to be arguing against the binary model of things like sex and gender, but I'm still going to use terms like male and female and girl and boy. This is just for the sake of convenience. If I were to make a long-form argument like this and have special language for the whole thing, this video would be unwatchable.
For the sake of convenience, or because there are two sexes and male and female are what they are called? What is the special language you could use instead, Forrest? To anyone who is objective and sceptical, this should be ringing alarm bells. To me, it comes across as disingenuous. Now, I'm not going to go through the video line by line. Over the next few minutes, he talks about how biologists define sex and the problems he perceives with that definition. I think it would have been great if he had made a separate video on that issue alone, because he is being controversial. As an antidote, I offer and highly recommend a recent article by Professor Thomas Bogardus entitled "How Our Shoes Can Help Explain the Biology of Sex," which, together with every other article or paper I mention in this video, I will link to below. At 7.5 minutes in, Forrest says this.
For example, the human Y chromosome contains instructions for a special kind of ribosome, which is the part of the cell that builds proteins. So protein synthesis is just very slightly different in me than it is for any female, and it has been since well before I had any hint of a gender.
The reason I've isolated this sentence is because it's the first mention of gender in the main part of the video. He's putting scare quotes round it, and he still hasn't defined what he means by it. He's giving us an example of something the Y chromosome does that has nothing to do with genitalia and gonads, and he's saying before he had any hint of a gender. From the context here, it seems that he is talking as if gender means sex characteristics. He seems to be conflating gender with sex. The next mention of gender is about 14 minutes in.
Over the years, I've studied in a lot of anatomy labs, and I've dissected a lot of human cadavers, as well as other animals, and we see variations all the time. Just differences from the textbook. Little changes in how an artery branches, or how a nerve passes through a muscle, or even big things like the shape or position of a whole organ. These are classified as variations and not deformities or anomalies because they happen a lot more often than you might think, and they don't really cause any harm. They're just relatively inconsequential differences between one person and another. So my question is it really so hard to accept that things like sex or gender could be subject to the same kinds of variations, and that those variations would be, at most, equally inconsequential?
Has anyone said they don't accept that there are variations? But what exactly is he talking about here? Does he mean anatomical variations as a result of differences in sex development, formerly known as intersex conditions? Because if that is what he's talking about, it would be inaccurate to say that they are inconsequential. Some of them can be accompanied by a range of health problems, and most people who have one or other of these conditions are infertile or subfertile, so that's not inconsequential, is it? It has a potentially catastrophic effect on the individual. But as my biologist friend pointed out, the infertility means that these deleterious mutations are mostly removed from the gene pool. They are rare, but if they were advantageous, they'd be selected for, and therefore be much more common than they are. By the way, if you asked Forrest's question the other way round, it reveals the fallacious nature of it. If you said, it is well established that there's a tiny minority of people who have disorders of the reproductive tract, is it so hard to accept that other variations in the body can occur, that an organ can be shaped or positioned differently from the textbooks? How does a disorder in sex development have anything to do with the position or shape of another organ or how an artery branches? As an argument, it's useless. As part of a gish gallop, it serves a purpose. Forrest then says,
This may shatter someone's whole worldview, but it needs to be said. In fact, if you take nothing else away from this video, I hope you understand this one point. An X or a Y chromosome is neither necessary nor is it sufficient for determining your sexual identity.
Sexual identity? X and Y are the sex-determining chromosomes, but he hasn't mentioned identity before. What does he mean by it? Usually I see that particular phrase, sexual identity, used to mean sexual orientation, whether someone is straight or gay or bisexual. And I've heard that use of it rejected for the same reason as many of us reject so-called gender identity. I don't identify as a woman. I am one. At the LGB Alliance conference I went to last year, I heard a speaker say she doesn't identify as a lesbian. She is one. That statement was greeted with cheers and tumultuous applause. Again, this notion of identity is ideological, not biological. And of course, chromosomes don't determine your sexual orientation. By the way, talking of the LGB Alliance, that organisation has been under constant attack by trans activists who just hate the fact that it has the temerity to stand for the rights of LGB people instead of prioritising the T people, and it is now facing its most serious challenge yet. It is having to defend its charity status against Mermaids, the charity that supports the transing of children. Below, I will link to their fundraiser. Please, if you can, make a donation. Now, where was I? Sexual identity. I've also seen that phrase used to refer to whether one identifies as male or female, as if you can identify with having an evolved reproductive function that you don't actually have. You might wish you had it, but you can't identify as having it. Could that be what Forrest means? I'm not sure. Let's carry on.
There is no standard template for male versus female development in biology, and unless you have had your DNA sequenced and analyzed by a developmental biologist, you have no idea what's going on with you in this respect.
What? Having reached my mid-60s and having had 2 normal pregnancies and birthed 2 healthy children, I don't think I need my DNA sequence to discover that my sex development was normal. An educated guess will suffice. This is just another genderist canard that comes up time and again. How can you really know if you're a man or a woman if you don't know your karyotype or whatever?
As it stands, there are more than enough variations on the sex chromosomes alone to make a male that is feminine enough or a female that is masculine enough to pass as the opposite gender in both social circles and even to themselves.
Again, use of the word gender without having defined it. He seems to be using it in exactly the same way as we use the word sex, as in the opposite sex. And what does he mean by even to themselves? Judging by the photos proudly posted by trans-identifying men on social media, apparently thinking they look like the epitome of femininity, I would say that they themselves are the easiest to fool, to be honest.
The language of genetics is in no way laconic or easy to decipher, and that makes it completely impossible to reduce things like sex and gender down to a binary. Gametes can be gendered in this way. Brains and bodies cannot.
Ridiculous. He seems to be saying that sex can't be binary because language doesn't allow it, and yet gametes can be gendered in the way brains and bodies cannot. So the language does allow us to say gametes are male or female, but not that bodies that evolved to produce either of the gametes are male or female.
The point that I'm trying to make here is that even what you might call normal is a massively diverse group of people. We all live on a spectrum.
What spectrum? What is the defining parameter? Oh my God, is he seriously trying to say that sex is a spectrum?
And people are under no obligation to make sense to you.
Well, that's a good job, isn't it? Because you're making no sense to me at the moment.
The other point that I'm trying to make is that we really need to stop saying things like XX equals girl. At most, we need to be saying things like people with XX are typically girls.
How about typically female, which covers both women and girls? Or how about just female, apart from the 1 in 25,000 males who have a 46XX karyotype?
We need to do away with all of this unnecessarily heteronormative language if we're going to ameliorate the way that our society perceives and treats gender as a whole.
Heteronormative, adjective, denoting or relating to a worldview that promotes heterosexuality as the normal or preferred sexual orientation. Nothing whatever to do with the sex-determining chromosomes, and you still haven't defined gender.
But to really understand what I mean by that, let's try to define gender. Gender is a fluid term.
Fluid. If that means it doesn't have a stable meaning and different people use it to mean different things, then I would agree. It's used for categorizing nouns in several foreign languages. It's described as a tool of a patriarchal system that oppresses women by dictating what we are supposed to do and be like. The most modern meaning, the woke meaning, seems to be using it for different personality types and claiming that these are genders.
And a social construct. And if you don't believe me on that, just think about this with me for a second. Can a real man wear a dress? Can a real woman fix a car? What about ordering a fruity cocktail? Who gets to do that? When you think about it for more than 2 seconds, you start to realize that the way that we define gender is completely arbitrary. I mean, consider the fact that our traditional nursery colors of blue for boys and pink for girls was only really established in the 1940s. The truth is that masculine and feminine really don't mean anything in concrete terms, certainly not in biological terms.
So by gender, you mean what we think of as masculine and feminine? Well, that's what I thought, but you use the word frequently to talk about biological stuff. Can't we just use the word sex when we mean sex and sexed when we mean sexed? I would contend that we don't have genders, but that things can be gendered, meaning that they fit cultural ideas of what is appropriate for either male or female people. Like when we say, oh, that's not very feminine, or gendered uniforms, gendered insults, gendered hairstyles, whatever.
Gender is just the term that we use for how an individual organism expresses their sexual identity in a cultural context.
Individual organism. What other organisms, apart from human beings, expresses anything in a cultural context?
Hello.
Okay. Where did you learn your biology, Forrest? Disney World?
It is a reflection of that individual's expectations and the society's expectations of their behavior. And just to really drive that point home, let's take a look at a few examples to show just how fuzzy gender really is. We've talked a little bit about sexual dimorphism. There are some species where the males are bigger and stronger than the females. There are also some species where the females are bigger and stronger than the males. And then there are a lot more species that are not dimorphic at all, and so the males and females are completely indistinguishable from one another.
What's that got to do with gender? You just said it's a social construct. Now you're telling us that some species are sexually dimorphic and others aren't. How does that make gender fuzzy? It doesn't. Sexual dimorphism or monomorphism are biological facts. They have nothing to do with gender as a social construct.
There are also plenty of species that have 3 or more genders or no genders at all.
Again, you've just said gender is a social construct. So how did these species get these socially constructed genders? Are you saying that in a given species, some show a preference for pink and others for blue and others for mauve? No, of course you're not. Again, this is where references would come in handy. I'll be damned if I'm going to wade through that long list of sources in the hope of finding out what species he's talking about. My biologist friend suggested he may be referring to behavioural differences. For example, there are species of fish, she tells me, which have large dominant males and very, very small males, so the latter let the big males do the courting and then nip in quick as the female releases the eggs and gets to fertilise quite a few of them. Cheeky little buggers. And here's a headline in The Guardian about a breed of sandpiper called Ruffs. Terrible headline, but the Stanford is even worse. It says it has 4 sexes. It doesn't. It has 2, but again, there are some amusing behavioural differences amongst the three different types of males, differences in appearance too. I did wonder if he was talking about bees, which of course have two sexes, but the queen and the workers and the drones each have distinct roles and all of them are important. It would be quite ridiculous to call them genders, but so much of what Forrest has been saying has been lacking in clarity and precision and conflating sex and gender that it wouldn't surprise me if that is what he means. But then after doing a bit more research, I'm thinking maybe he means these nematodes whose mating system involves males, females and hermaphrodites. I'm just splicing in a bit here because when I gave my biologist friend, some of you may know her actually, her name is Alison Wren from Bristol. When I showed Alison the preview of this video, she suggested clarifying that hermaphrodite organisms can either be sequential, i.e. male at one stage of life and female at a different stage, for example clownfish, or have both male and female organs in the body at the same time, but usually mate with a partner, like earthworms or slugs. So they are called synchronous hermaphrodites. It is, of course, utterly wrong to refer to individuals who are born with ambiguous genitalia as hermaphrodites. Forrest then bangs on about different mating systems in different species and thankfully doesn't mention the word gender here. Just an overwhelming amount of information and no referencing, and then we get this.
And as I said in the beginning of this video, humans are not special in any of this. We are just animals. The one cool thing that we've got going on for us is that we are the only animals that can communicate in great detail how it feels to have a gender.
Okay, so how does it feel to have a gender, Forrest? Enlighten those of us who don't know, because I can't tell you how it feels to be a woman. I can only tell you what it feels like to be me in a given circumstance. Even things that only women do, like being pregnant and giving birth, I can tell you what it was like for me, but I know other women whose experiences have been very different. But apart from the experiences we have because of our sexed bodies, female and male, what do we feel like that is down to this thing called gender, which you have claimed is a social construct, but which you now seem to be saying is some innate essence, but one that can change because, as you said at the beginning, the argument that you can't change gender is stupid. It would indeed be cool if people who claim to have a gender identity that doesn't accord with their sex could tell us exactly how it feels, but they never do. Very often they will talk about being distressed at being the sex they are, at the sight of their sexed bodies. Sometimes they talk about having wanted to hang out with children of the opposite sex and play with their toys instead of the ones they were expected to play with. But most often we hear them saying that they just know. It's an internal sense, which means nothing. So much for being able to communicate in great detail. Or great detail, I don't know it was pronounced like that. In my experience, they can't communicate it at all.
We should not be afraid of these differences between cis and trans and gay and straight or whatever. We should be excited for an opportunity to learn how life really works, rather than just trying to cram everything down into boxes all the time.
Says the man who has just used the ridiculous label cis, a label rejected by, I believe, the majority of the population who don't belong in your trans box. We are not afraid of difference. We are afraid when men use this difference to hurt women, and that is something Forrest doesn't address.
If we want to understand what it means to be anything, we need to focus on science and be listening to the people who are living the lives that we want to understand.
And the people you want to understand exclude the women who don't go along with the idea that men can be women, let alone lesbians, and who are being erased as a sex class because of a supposed feeling that is not measurable or verifiable. Or is it?
And speaking of understanding, let's take a minute to talk about brains.
Oh, here we go. I'm skipping a little bit about the difference between female and male brains because it doesn't add anything to what I said in the video I made last year about trans brains, and so far as I can see he doesn't include the most up-to-date studies in his sources at the end, but...
And here's a fun fact for you. Trans people have been consistently shown to have neural architecture in these areas that matches their gender identity, not their genitalia. So for example, the BSTC is about 50% larger in men than it is in women. A trans man, so someone transitioning from female to male, has a BSTC that is the size of a cis man's. And similarly, a trans woman has a BSTC that is the size of a cis woman's. These are structural differences that cannot be accounted for with any amount of sexual reassignment surgery or any amount of hormone therapy. This is literally having a female brain trapped inside a male body or vice versa.
The claim that genderists make about brains doesn't usually go into the minutiae of neural networks and the central subdivision of the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, which is what BSTC stands for, and all that stuff. What they claim is that the brains of trans people are the same as those of the people whose sex they identify with, although they call it gender. There is nothing nuanced about that claim. What Forrest says here is very misleading, possibly disingenuous, and again he doesn't provide specific references for specific claims he makes. There have actually been rather few studies on the brains of trans-identifying people, and by omitting that fact, Forrest is in danger of giving the impression that there is an impressive volume of work. I did look through the sources at the end that mention brains, and a couple of them I was familiar with, and they are already notorious for their flaws. These studies on the brain structure were conducted using post-mortem brain tissue. On the one led by Zhu, he made his conclusions on just 6 trans-identifying men and 1 trans-identifying woman, and all of them had been on cross-sex hormones. I'll link to them below if you want to have a look. There is nothing settled about the brains of trans-identifying people, or indeed of male and female people, and Forrest talks as if it is settled, and in doing so he gives ammunition to those with an ideological agenda. He's not a neuroscientist. He doesn't mention neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to change and adapt to new experiences and environments. And he doesn't mention the importance of longitudinal studies, which means examining a series of brain scans to determine if there are changes over time. But at the end of the day, it doesn't make a blind bit of difference what goes on in the brains of trans-identifying people, because women are not oppressed because of their brains, but because of their bodies and role in reproduction. And when you've got some men acting in an oppressive fashion and colonizing womanhood for their own purposes, it doesn't bloody matter what size their BSTC is. Brains don't win sports medals, and violent predators don't care about our so-called gender identity. Here, in case you can't see them, are a couple of horrific reports of trans-identifying women getting raped once it was discovered that they are, in fact, women. Finally, Forrest plays the intersex gambit. We don't need to listen to it. And he concludes that
it is so much easier just to say that things like sex and gender and sexual orientation exist on a spectrum.
This claim that sex is a spectrum is again one for which a reference is required. The citation of a peer-reviewed biology paper explaining how sex is a spectrum. There's no point in searching through Forrest's sources because no such paper exists. I can certainly accept that there is a range of sexual orientations between totally gay and totally straight. And as for gender, it's a load of crap. Okay, if you're talking about gender expression, yes, some people will present as ultra-feminine, some as ultra-masculine. Most of us are in between, and women have a much wider choice in expression while still being called gender conforming. I'm not saying that's fair, but it is how it is. As I've always said, cultural expectations of how we are allowed to express ourselves should be challenged. But sex is not a spectrum. Almost all of us are unambiguously male or female, in spite of various disorders of sex development. Cases of ambiguity are vanishingly rare, and their existence does not mean that sex is a spectrum. Forrest isn't the only scientist, if that is what he is, to misuse his education and knowledge in support of a scientifically unsupportable ideology and to be apparently oblivious of the harm it is causing. I can only emphasize again how important it is to be skeptical of scientists who talk about sociological concepts like gender, who conflate sex with gender one minute and then claim it's a social construct the next, or to talk about it as if it's an innate sense without being able to communicate in great detail what it is, because it doesn't take much to show that what they say doesn't stand up to scrutiny. I think I've said enough. Thanks for watching. Bye.